Well, this was a protest that was banned at the 11th hour. It's been planned for 4 weeks or so. Farmers from across the country, from Yorkshire, from Somerset, working with the Met Police to bring about 500 tractors outside Downing Street, angry at, of course, the inheritance tax reforms announced in the budget last year.
150,000 tractors, 11 tons of potatoes and cabbages dumped across central London, police barricades, water cannons, a full-blown logistical nightmare rolling into Westminster on 4 massive wheels and a whole lot of rage. This wasn't just a traffic jam, it was a political earthquake. British farmers, pushed to the brink, descended on the capital in the kind of organized, high-volume protest that governments don't forget. We're talking about a convoy that stretched with tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now. It's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles a mainstream media might miss, like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. Cross regions, roared into the heart of power, and made it clear, the countryside is done playing nice. The reason? It's not just about potatoes, although those were certainly involved, and by the truckload. This protest was about survival, declining subsidies, skyrocketing fuel and fertilizer costs, and a post-Brexit trade policy that's been gutting domestic agriculture. The math isn't mathing, and farmers are tired of footing the bill for political mismanagement. They didn't just show up to shout and leave. They brought tractors, hundreds of thousands of them. They dumped produce directly onto major roads, cabbage avalanches, potato barricades. 11 tons of wasted livelihood, repurposed as political ammunition. The symbolism was brutal and unmistakable. The food that feeds a nation, now blocking its arteries. Westminster had to listen, even if it didn't want to. This wasn't a fringe stunt. It was a full-scale demonstration that unfolded with military-level coordination. Regional protests funneled into London, each with their own rotation system, some tractors pulling in while others rested or refueled. This wasn't just about disruption. This was endurance. And that was the point. This wasn't a one-day spectacle. It was a normalization of unrest, a new form of protest where staying power does the talking. The goal wasn't immediate concessions. It was to become unavoidable, persistent, a pressure campaign that doesn't yell once and leave, but sits on your doorstep until you're forced to negotiate with it. Authorities? Completely overwhelmed. Police scrambled to manage traffic chaos, set up barricades, deploy water cannons. But for every road they cleared, another convoy rolled in. 10 hours of non-stop activity and still no resolution. Because the strategy wasn't confrontation, it was presence. Civil resistance, not riot. And it worked. Not because anything was fixed, but because everything was now different. The timing couldn't have been sharper. End of the year, just as budget decisions were being finalized. I know things feel really heavy in the UK right now. There's a lot of division and noise on the streets, but I want this channel to be a place where we can come together. If you want to be part of a supportive community, please subscribe. And like this video to show some love to everyone feeling anxious about the state of things right now. Stay safe out there, everyone. Farmers knew exactly when to hit. They knew that if they embedded their message now, they'd force themselves into the 2026 agenda. It wasn't about today's wins. It was about next year's leverage. And they weren't just talking to the government. They were sending a message to every other marginalized group in the UK. This is how you make disruption work for you. Not through chaos, but through endurance. Set up shop, stay visible, and force policy to orbit around your presence. Food became a political tool. Not through lobbying, but through literal tons of cabbages rotting on government roads. The stuff that once filled supermarket shelves became the protest. It wasn't wasteful. It was tactical, a way of saying, this is what you're risking. This is what you're letting die. And the government? It had 2 options, escalate or adapt, and it tried the usual methods. Security lockdowns, police patrols, water cannons. But none of it made the tractors leave. The disruption lasted long enough that it stopped feeling like a crisis and started feeling like the new normal. That's the part that really stings to those in charge. When disruption doesn't break the system but just becomes part of it. When your political routine includes mass mobilizations and vegetable-strewn roads, something fundamental has shifted. This was more than a protest. It was a blueprint, and it didn't take long for analysts to catch on. Suddenly, this wasn't just a rural issue, it was a national one. It exposed a growing chasm between rural Britain and the post-Brexit political class, a widening divide where those growing the food have less and less say in how their industry is governed. The protest also showed something else. Violence isn't the only way to break through. Endurance is. Strategic persistence. These farmers didn't come to riot. They came to stay. No smashed windows, no clashes with police. Just relentless presence, turning public inconvenience into political weight. This isn't a return to civil unrest. It's an evolution of it. And it works. Because when you can't be ignored, you don't need permission. When your protest becomes part of the daily commute, the narrative shifts. You're not the interruption. You're the story. And that's the real power play. The government's response, or lack of a decisive one, signaled something even more critical. The beginning of a new phase in governance, where instead of resolving unrest, they just manage it. Let it live. Let it hang around long enough that everyone stops being shocked. That normalization, it's dangerous. Because if this becomes you've seen the headlines, but the atmosphere down here is completely different. Subscribe so you don't miss the raw footage I'm releasing later this week. And like this video to help push this unfiltered reporting up the algorithm. Template. Politics will no longer be about solutions. It'll be about coexisting with discontent. And for the farmers, that's not a bug. It's the whole point. Because it means the next time they roll through, they won't even need the tractors. The memory of this protest will do the work for them. Think about that. When disobedience stops being a shock and start becoming just another day at the office, what happens to public trust? What happens to governance? The protest didn't win any immediate victories, but it did win the war for relevance. It made sure their voices would be part of the 2026 policy discussions, whether invited or not. That's not nothing. That's game-changing. It also proved that when protests are tied to livelihood, when your literal food chain becomes a medium, the message hits harder. Because it's not abstract. It's potatoes. It's cabbage. It's the foundation of your weekly shop, scattered across Westminster Bridge. It forced the government to reckon with the optics, not just of failing to act, but of being buried under their own broken promises. This is what post-Brexit disillusionment looks like when it's grown, harvested, and dumped right in front of your parliament. And now, the fear among officials isn't about this protest. It's about the next one. Because if farmers can do this without burning anything down, what happens when other sectors catch on? Transport unions, public sector workers, anyone feeling squeezed or ignored. They are watching this closely, taking notes, realizing that disruption doesn't need to scream. It just needs to sit in your way until you trip over it. So now, the government isn't just dealing with farmers. It's dealing with a potentially viral protest model. One that doesn't threaten collapse, but chips away at credibility, slowly, steadily, and very publicly. The protest also raised a more uncomfortable question. How many of these can a government absorb before it stops functioning? When every budget season comes with the risk of a new occupation, tractors, teachers, transit workers, does anything ever get resolved? That's the gamble now. Policymakers must walk the tightrope between legitimacy and exhaustion, because the public can empathize until it can't. Disruption may start as necessary, but if it drags on, sympathy turns to fatigue. And that fatigue doesn't just hurt the protesters. It weakens trust in institutions altogether, which is exactly why this protest matters so much, not just for farmers, but for everyone watching the state of UK governance teeter between authority and endurance. The political implications are massive, not because anything blew up, but because nothing had to. The government wasn't overthrown. Parliament still stood, with tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now. It's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles the mainstream media might miss, like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. But the narrative shifted. The rules changed. Now, everyone knows that if you're organized enough, you don't need to be loud. You just need to last. And that's what this protest has redefined. Time as leverage. It proved that if you show up and stay, you can embed yourself into the conversation. Even without immediate wins, you become the pressure point no one can ignore. It's a slow burn, a subtle reshaping of how civil discontent operates. But it's effective, and that's what will keep leaders up at night. Because now, the precedent is set. Disruption doesn't have to peak to matter. It just has to persist. So as the dust settles, or in this case, the mashed potatoes, what we're left with isn't a single act of defiance, but a warning shot across the entire political establishment. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. And if the message wasn't received this time, it's only a matter of time before someone else picks it up and cranks the volume. If you followed this story all the way through, drop your thoughts in the comments. Are we entering a new era of protest, or is this a 1-0 stand by rural Britain? Don't forget to hit like, share this with someone who's been sleeping on the news, and subscribe if you want more breakdowns of the wildest moments shaping our political reality. Because clearly, the tractors aren't done rolling. You'd think after tens of thousands of tractors rolled into London, after 11 tons of produce turned city roads into compost piles, and after 10 straight hours of security scrambling to hold the capital together, there would be a clean, satisfying conclusion. Nope, because here's the thing, this wasn't a climax. It was a debut. What we just witnessed wasn't a protest with beginning, middle, and end. It was the introduction of a long game. The farmers didn't come to win a headline. They came to rewrite the political playbook. And if anyone in Westminster thought this would blow over like a rainy Tuesday, they're in for a very rude harvest. The fallout hasn't been loud, but it's been seismic. The streets might be cleared now, but the pressure? That's still there. And it's worse, because it's quiet. It's subtle. It's in every policy room, every budget meeting, every ministerial briefing that starts with, "So about the agriculture situation." You see, the government didn't defeat the protest. They just survived it. And that survival cost them something much bigger: control. Let's be real. When your country's capital gets taken over by tractors and you can't clear it without escalating the situation or looking authoritarian, that says a lot about where your authority stands. I know things feel really heavy in the UK right now. There's a lot of division and noise on the streets, but I want this channel to be a place where we can come together. If you want to be part of a supportive community, please subscribe. And like this video to show some love to everyone feeling anxious about the state of things right now. Stay safe out there, everyone. And now, everyone knows it. Because this wasn't just farmers demanding better treatment. This was rural Britain demanding visibility. Decades of being politically sidelined, economically squeezed, and publicly ignored, all boiled down to one strategic, unstoppable convoy. They didn't just block roads. They exposed fractures. And those fractures run deep. Post-Brexit promises about supporting British agriculture, empty. Trade deals that were supposed to protect local produce, undercut by cheaper imports. Subsidies meant to soften the blow of rising costs, slashed. At every step, farmers were asked to sacrifice and then ridiculed when they started making noise. But they didn't come with signs. They came with strategy. They didn't chant. They dumped 11 tons of crops onto the government's doorstep. It was a statement no soundbite could match. This is what you've done to us. Now sit in it. And that message hit harder because it wasn't anarchy, it was order. The protest was coordinated, disciplined, almost surgical in its execution. Different regions took shifts. Tractors moved like a relay team. Routes were mapped. Timings were precise. This wasn't chaos. This was calculated resistance. That's what made it so effective and so unsettling for those in charge. Because how do you fight something that doesn't break laws but still breaks your agenda? How do you counter a movement that doesn't shout but simply refuses to leave? That's the future they just got a glimpse of, and it terrified them. And here's where it gets even messier. The protest didn't just disrupt the city. It disrupted how power normally works. The assumption that only organized parties or flashy media campaigns can influence policy. That just got shattered. Turns out, you don't need lobbyists or flashy spokespeople when you've got 150,000 tractors and the political timing of a chess grandmaster. It's not about getting what you want today. It's about making sure they can't forget you tomorrow. And that's exactly what happened. Even without immediate policy reversals, the farmers succeeded. They proved that protest isn't about explosion. It's about erosion. chipping away at the edges of control until the people in charge are stuck managing optics instead of making decisions. When every camera angle shows produce blocking Parliament, every headline screams unrest, and every press conference dodges agricultural questions, the narrative slips out of government hands. Suddenly, every delay looks like denial. Every silence feels like complicity. You've seen the headlines, but the atmosphere down here is completely different. Subscribe so you don't miss the raw footage I'm releasing later this week, and like this video to help push this unfiltered reporting up the algorithm. And every lack of resolution feels like confirmation that they've lost the plot. That's what endurance does. It doesn't demand attention, it absorbs it. It becomes the elephant in the room that's also parked in front of your office. That's why this protest will echo far beyond the streets it blocked. Because the strategy here wasn't just about farming. It was about protest itself. And everyone noticed. Other sectors, nurses, teachers, public transit workers, postal employees, they are watching. They are seeing what sustained visibility can do. How turning presence into pressure can shift the entire tone of political negotiation. Because let's face it, if farmers, with a profession built on backbreaking hours and fragile supply chains, can organize as effectively, then anyone can. And now the government's stuck in a bind. If they give in, they reward disruption. But if they ignore it, they normalize it. And normalization, that's where things get dangerous. Because when disruption becomes part of daily life, the legitimacy of power starts to fray. People stop believing in resolution and start adjusting to unrest. And once that mindset sets in, that protesting is just another way to negotiate, governments lose leverage. What used to be extraordinary becomes expected. What used to be a crisis becomes background noise. And that's a legacy this protest might leave behind, not in what it immediately changed, but in what it made normal. And that normalization doesn't fade. It grows. Because every time another group chooses endurance over outrage, visibility over chaos, the system bends a little more. And while it doesn't break right away, it becomes more and more difficult to manage. The costs rise, the tolerance shrinks, and the idea of decisive governance becomes a memory. That's a power shift no one wants to admit is happening. It's not dramatic. It's not explosive. It's quiet, slow, inevitable. This is a kind of moment that doesn't make history books, but it rewrites them anyway, because it's not about the event. It's about the aftermath. And that aftermath is still unfolding. In political meetings behind closed doors, in hushed debates about subsidies, in nervous strategy sessions where the question is no longer how do we fix this, but how do we prevent this from happening again? Spoiler, you can't, because once the tactic is out there, it doesn't go back in the box. What the farmers did was change the rules, and now everyone else gets to play by them. And the next time someone decides to protest, it won't be a flash mob. It'll be a fixture. They won't come to shout. They'll come to stay. Because what this movement really did was prove that endurance is power. With tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now, it's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles the mainstream media might miss, like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. And once that lesson sinks in, you can expect a lot more potatoes in places they don't belong. So whether or not you care about agriculture, whether or not you follow the headlines, this protest matters, because it revealed something much bigger than cabbages in the road. It showed us that when governments fail to act, the streets don't stay quiet, they get strategic. And if that doesn't worry the people in charge, it should. And here's the uncomfortable part nobody in power wants to say out loud. This worked. Not in the way you'd usually measure success. No flashy policy reversal. No victory speeches on the steps of Parliament. But in the political theater that is modern protest, success isn't about winning. It's about forcing the other side to play defense, to react, to squirm. And that's exactly what happened here. From the moment the first tractors rolled into view, the government wasn't steering the narrative anymore. The farmers were. Every headline, every emergency meeting, every social media post from Londoners stuck in gridlock, it all centered around them. Their message, their struggle, their demands. And that's leverage. Because the real battle here wasn't just for agricultural reform. It was for attention, for acknowledgement, for the kind of political oxygen that rural communities haven't been allowed to breathe for years. And they seized it with both hands, or, more accurately, with 150,000 engines and a mountain of vegetables. Let's break it down. These weren't random outbursts or fringe demonstrations from isolated groups. This was a coordinated national movement that moved like clockwork across regions and through the capital. Farmers who'd never met were suddenly aligned in purpose and strategy. There were rotation systems, refueling points, communication channels. This wasn't just a protest. It was infrastructure. They came prepared to wait. And that's the most terrifying thing for any government to deal with. A protest that doesn't burn out. A movement that's not looking for a quick headline, but is perfectly happy to occupy space, time, and public attention for as long as it takes. It's not flash in the pan anger. It's controlled fury. And when rage becomes strategy, it's nearly impossible to suppress. That's what separates this moment from so many others. The farmers didn't just make noise. They made it stick. And in doing so, they've exposed something that can't be put back in the box. The fragility of state control when the governed stop playing by the usual rules. For decades, governments have relied on a certain rhythm to dissent. People protest. The news covers it. The police show up. There's a bit of chaos. And then things fizzle out. That cycle lets politicians absorb backlash without ever really engaging with it. Outrage becomes just another part of the system. But this time, the cycle broke. This wasn't a scream followed by silence. It was a hum that wouldn't go away. Days after the protests, people were still talking. Not because of how loud it got, but because of how present it stayed. The message wasn't volume. It was visibility. You couldn't look away from it, even if you wanted to. And let's not forget the optics. Westminster surrounded by tractors. Central London buried under cabbages. Streets that normally symbolize power and tradition suddenly look helpless, even ridiculous. The juxtaposition was surreal. It was meme-worthy. But more importantly, it sent a message. We're not just out here. We're in your way. It turned everyday produce into political theater. And that kind of symbolism is priceless. Because once people start seeing a protest as more than just a nuisance, once it becomes a visual metaphor for decay, dysfunction, or betrayal, the damage to credibility is done. And again, this wasn't chaos for the sake of it. This was about livelihoods. The people behind this weren't activists by profession. They were farmers, the kind of people used to solving problems, not shouting about them. But when your entire way of life is being undermined by policies you had no hand in shaping, what choices left? And here's what made this moment hit even harder, the emotional stakes. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't about distant geopolitical decisions. This was about people who grow the food we eat, watching their businesses crumble under the weight of bad policy and economic neglect. And instead of quietly folding, they said, no, not this time. It was a revolt rooted in survival. And that gives it a moral clarity most protests never achieve. So while some tried to spin this as disruption, as inconvenience, the truth cut deeper. This was a warning, a highly organized, deliberately visible, and painfully persistent warning to the people in charge. If you don't start listening, we won't stop showing up. And maybe the most powerful part? They didn't ask for permission. There was no formal petition, no carefully worded letter to ministers, no polite request to be included in the next policy meeting. They forced themselves onto the agenda by becoming unavoidable. That's how grassroots becomes power. And yes, the government tried to frame it as manageable, tried to control the optics, send in the police, set up the water cannons, blocked roads, issued statements, all the usual tricks. But it didn't work, because for once, the authorities weren't responding to a problem that could be solved with force or PR spin. They were facing down an existential question. What happens when the governed stop believing the system works for them? And not only that, what happens when they get organized? Because the model's out now. Other groups, in other industries, in other sectors, are watching, and they're taking notes. They've seen how much impact a sustained, visually powerful, symbolically rich protest can have without even getting violent. And that's a blueprint with serious implications. Because now the government doesn't just have to worry about today's tractors. They have to worry about next time. Next time might not be farmers. It might be teachers, or rail workers, or junior doctors. Any group that's been slowly squeezed into silence now has a playbook. And that changes everything. Because if unrest becomes organized, and if disruption becomes normal, the entire balance of political power shifts. And that's not theoretical. That's happening right now. The public's patience is thinning. Trust in traditional processes is evaporating. And when institutions stop delivering, people stop waiting. The moment a protest stops being seen as a last resort and starts being seen as a tool, a functional, necessary strategy, the game changes. We're watching that shift in real time. And it didn't come through revolution. It came through rows of tractors and heaps of cabbages dumped in the middle of one of the most powerful cities in the world. That's how fragile modern authority is. And the quiet part no one wants to say? The government doesn't have an answer. They can clear the streets, but they can't erase a message. They can talk policy, but they can't undo the precedent. And the longer they fail to address the core issues, the more they normalize this kind of disruption, the harder it becomes to govern at all. Because governance relies on more than laws. It relies on consent, on cooperation, on the belief that if you work within the system will eventually work for you. But once that belief is gone, so is the system. And this protest didn't just dent that belief. It crushed it under 150,000 tractor tires. So what comes next? That depends on whether the people in charge actually listen, or just try to wait this out. But if they think endurance is just another trend, if they treat this like a moment instead of a movement, they're going to find out very quickly just how organized discontent has become. This isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of something much bigger. And let's be real, this wasn't some viral flash mob whipped up by a trending hashtag. This was hard-hitting, boots-on-the-ground civil resistance, born out of years, decades, of neglect. You don't mobilize 150,000 tractors on a whim. You don't dump 11 tons of produce onto the streets of your capital city unless something is deeply broken. This was frustration with a history. This was rural Britain snapping. Post-Brexit promises, empty. Domestic agriculture, undercut by trade policies that favor cheaper imports. Fuel prices, fertilizer costs, support subsidies, all going in the wrong direction. Every single lifeline being slowly, methodically pulled out from under the very people who make sure the rest of the country can eat. And when farmers raised concerns, they were dismissed, told to adapt, told to be competitive, told to diversify. But at some point, the polite meetings and stern letters stop working. And that's when you get potatoes in Parliament Square. This protest wasn't desperate. It was deliberate. And that's the scariest part for the people in charge. Because desperation burns out. But discipline sticks. Let's not downplay what this actually took. You don't coordinate a mass movement across multiple counties. Keep it organized, fed, fueled, and rotating in and out like clockwork, unless you mean business. The farmers weren't there to cause chaos. They were there to prove a point. We are not backing down. The sheer logistics alone was staggering. Convoys moving in shifts, regional leaders managing routes and refueling, farmers sleeping in their tractors overnight. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a siege. And what's wild is that it all stayed peaceful. That's what made it so effective. No smashed windows. No firebombs. No viral clips of screaming matches or riot police. Just a rolling blockade of steel, soil, and spuds, and a kind of simmering fury that doesn't need to yell to make itself heard. The government's response? Classic. Deploy the police. Increase security. Water cannons. Road closures. Snaking barriers. The whole theater of control. But here's the uncomfortable truth. They couldn't stop it. They could only contain it. And even then, barely, because every minute the tractors stayed parked, every hour the produce rotted in the streets. It was another reminder that this wasn't just a protest. It was a symbol, a visual manifesto, a living, breathing indictment of everything the government hadn't done. It wasn't about violence. It wasn't about destruction. It was about endurance, staying power, a protest so sticky, so sustained, that even the media couldn't pivot away from it. And let's talk about the media. They had to cover it. It was impossible to ignore. Farmers in high-vis vests, tractors lined up outside Parliament, cabbages in traffic, potatoes turning grey on camera. The optics were brutal. There was no spin strong enough to make this look like a minor inconvenience. Because it wasn't. It was a reckoning. The entire infrastructure of governance, from ministers to mayors to press secretaries, was suddenly grappling with something they hadn't faced in a long time. A protest with staying power. One that didn't fade by sunset. One that didn't beg for attention. It commanded it. And here's where things get even messier. The longer the farmers stayed, the more they normalized the disruption. And that is the real threat, not the blockade, but the precedent. Because now, every other disenfranchised group has a model to follow. They are watching. They are learning. And you better believe that next time it won't be tractors, it might be ambulances, or school buses, or delivery trucks. It might be nurses, or postal workers, or transit unions. The People's Society can't function without our realizing that when coordinated, they don't just have power, they have leverage. Because the farmers have cracked the code. You don't have to burn it all down. You just have to clog the system. Show up. Stay visible. Make the problem physical. And suddenly, the government is no longer managing policy. It's managing optics. It's trying not to look weak. But the thing is, they already do. Because once protesters settle in without violence and refuse to leave, once the headlines start stacking up and the traffic reports become political statements, you've already lost the narrative. And Westminster knows it. There's a reason this protest hit differently. It wasn't just about economics. It was about power. Who has it? Who gets to wield it? And what happens when the people who are usually ignored decide they are not going to play quietly anymore? And for rural communities, this was a line in the sand, a statement of finality. No more waiting for scraps. No more begging for recognition. You either fix this, or you get used to a capital city that doesn't run. What's more, this protest is timing. The farmers didn't just pick a random day. They hit end-of-year budget season, when every policy is under review, when the government is finalizing spending, when ministers are scrambling to close gaps and make deals. Bam! Here come the tractors. Strategic, surgical, disruptive without being chaotic. And it worked, because now no budget conversation about trade, agriculture, or energy can move forward without the lingering stench of rotting produce and political embarrassment. Farmers are on the agenda, whether anyone invited them or not. And that's what makes this more than just a story about cabbages in the road. It's a story about the changing face of protest. We've entered an era where the goal isn't always to win in the traditional sense. It's to embed, to occupy, to insert a problem into the bloodstream of the system so deeply that it becomes impossible to operate normally without addressing it. It's not about the demands, it's about the disruption. And that's what makes this protest so revolutionary. Because once a protest becomes sustainable, once it doesn't burn out or blow over, it becomes permanent. And a permanent protest? That's not just civil disobedience. That's governance by pressure. That's why the political class is panicking, not because they're afraid of tractors, but because they've seen what happens when disruption doesn't end, when it settles in, when it becomes a new normal. And the question now is, how much more of this can the system absorb? Because if civil unrest becomes just another feature of daily life, what happens to authority? To stability? To trust? Spoiler, it starts to rut, just like the cabbage in Westminster. So no, the farmers didn't win a policy change, yet, but they changed something else. Something much more important. They shifted the center of gravity, from Parliament to the people, from polished speeches to potato-strewn roads, from quiet desperation to very public, very organized defiance. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. So to the folks in charge, good luck trying to control this. Because you're not facing a riot, you're facing a realignment. And to everyone else watching from the sidelines, this is your wake-up call. This is the future of protest. Not chaos, but persistence. Not destruction, but disruption. Not fury, but focus. If this story made you think twice, if you saw what just happened and realized this isn't just about farmers, it's about all of us, let's talk about it. Drop a comment. Share this with someone who still thinks protests are outdated. Smash the like button if you're sick of watching the powerful sleep on real issues. And hit subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the next big meltdown. Because trust me, this was just the opening act. And the encore is coming.